At 0230 on the 8th of August 1942, the captains of the President Adams, President Hayes, Alhena and Crescent City received orders to shift from the reserve force section off Guadalcanal to anchorage off Tulagi. By 0600, the 4 ships were moored in Transport Area Yoke, Transport Group Y. At 0300, the alarm bells rang for reinforcements to support the 1st Raiders and 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines on Tulagi. In the pre-dawn hours, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, plus elements of batteries H and I of the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, aboard the Alhena, were ordered to land with their 75mm pack howitzers. At 0705, the orders were rescinded, and a new directive was issued. The invasion forces were doing well, but the Marines there could use some help in a final mopping up. There was no reason why the ring-bolt operation should have been in trouble, as more than 1,500 Marines were on Tulagi. The situations on Gavutu and Tanambogo, on the other hand, were still very much in doubt. There, the few battle-weary paramarines who were still able to stand were lucky. The others were either on stretchers or awaiting burial. The tactical reserve of the 2nd Marines and its supporting units was alerted at 0800 and ordered to proceed to Tulagi and Gavutu. At 0945, Combat Team A, the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, less Companies B and C, landed at Beach Blue on Tulagi with orders to mop up and sweep to the centre and the rock area of snipers. The Japanese forces had dwindled, yet an occasional sea infantryman took potshots at stray Marines until they were whittled down one by one. James Sorensen, A. 1/2, described his company's part in clearing out Tulagi. At dawn on the 8th, we were reboated from Florida and told we were to make a landing on Tulagi to back up the Raider Battalion, which had found itself in a rather stiff fight. We were picked up on Halavo Beach by Higgins' craft and shifted to Tulagi. Due to the coral at the landing zone, we disembarked at a point about 50 yards from the shoreline and waded in. The landing zone was directly opposite the Chinese cemetery, and we moved across this area quickly to the base of the ridge running down from the centre of Tulagi. We came under automatic weapons and sniper fire from the ridge, but it did not last for more than a few minutes. W. Katsuzo Fukimoto had pulled most of his squad, snipers, out of the sector to join the main force adjacent to the middle of the island, leaving a few men behind to harass the Marines. The raiders were engaged in a major fight at this time towards the eastern end of Tulagi. Our Company A, under Captain Paul W. Furop, was ordered to move over the ridge above the cemetery and to the east of Sasapi, to the north of the ridge. We turned west, then on the northern slope, and proceeded to sweep this side of the ridge. We came under intermittent automatic and persistent sniper fire as we cleaned out this side. The movement lasted no more than a couple of hours, and in the process, a handful of enemy snipers were eliminated. At this point, we had apparently reached the extreme west end of the ridgeline. We reversed our move, then traversed back to Sesapi, then crossed the ridge by a deep cut through the ridge in the vicinity of Sesapi, and then crossed the ridge and back to the cemetery. Although no longer facing an expected hail of bullets, the Marines could not take safety for granted. Bill Cannon of Company C, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, witnessed this when part of his battalion deployed from Florida Island to Tulagi. On D+1, dawn saw us re-embarking in our Higgins boats for a quick trip to Tulagi. We landed on Tulagi at the Chinese cemetery and had to suffer through another combat landing at the hands of the nervous gunners on the landing craft. This barrage lasted about 20 minutes, doing nothing, just shredding vegetation. We were assigned to patrol the mid-island and clean out the enemy. At one point we were feeling safe, then one shot rang out. A sniper sent a bullet through Pursuit Joseph H. Jenks's neck. He was the company's first casualty. Jenks was evacuated on the Neville. I never heard any further from him. One of the responsibilities of Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was guarding the Assistant Commander, Brig. General William H. Rupertus, who was placed in charge of the Tulagi Northern Landing Force, NLF, and operations of the satellite islands of Gavutu, Tanambogo, and Macambo. He landed with his staff, all in well-pressed, starched uniforms, on Tulagi's Western Beach Blue from his command post aboard the Neville at 12:34 on Saturday, the 8th of August. Dallas Bennett, HQ, 2 halves, remembers, Beach Blue was at a place where the Japanese had established a cemetery and was heavily forested. On arrival, we did not get a small greeting card from the Japanese troops in the form of machine gun fire. I thought that maybe Japanese don't shoot at generals. I was mistaken. We took off our packs and were just about to plot our position when a sniper took a pot shot at someone, and we all hit the ground. Then all our machine guns and rifles opened up, and the blasting lasted about 5 minutes. No more discriminating shots were fired our way. Then quiet. A cease-firing order was issued. At the time Headquarters Company 2 halves landed on the beaches of Tulagi, they had been outside the zone of fire riding in the waves of Tulagi harbour attempting to land, and it was noontime before they could reach their disembarking point. Tulagi was in shambles. We safely delivered the General to the 1st Raider Battalion command post at a house called the Residency, situated on one of the highest elevations and about midway on this less than 100-acre island. He took no part in the active field command until he turned up at 1300 on the 8th. Snipers took advantage of the cover afforded by underbrush and trees, caves, bomb shelters and rocks, as well as buildings. Many of Tulagi's buildings were built 2 to 3 feet above ground level, with metal roofs and water tanks to catch the rainwater, since there was no fresh water on the island. The enemy utilized these buildings, their attics and water tanks for sniper cover. Each had to be destroyed or given a spray of machine gun fire and grenades. One such building, clearly marked as a hospital, contained snipers. Eliminating snipers and machine gun nests sometimes took ingenuity. Gunnery Sergeant Jesse R. Glover, an old China hand from Company H, used his team and grenades to greet these holdouts. He had once climbed up on the shoulders of squad members to reach the attic of a Japanese-occupied building used as a sniper post. He threw 2 grenades through the window and yelled, "Good morning, you poges!" Glover then climbed down and calmly walked inside to check his handiwork. All 6 occupants were dead. One of the last caves to be neutralized was one dug midway through the ground-level passageway cut from the Government Wharf to King George Field on the opposite side of the island. This was cut only about 10 feet wide and nearly 30-40 feet deep. This had been a shortcut to the other side. Caves dug into the limestone sidewalls by the Japanese made it almost impossible to approach the openings without being exposed to those inside. Directly in front of the caves, the warriors set up a sandbag fort and had men facing either way and firing. Marines of Company D poured fire of every caliber gun or weapon on hand at the barricade from both ends of the hill cutout. Actually, it is a wonder Marines did not hit their buddies who were on the other end, as both were firing at the Japanese barricade in the middle. The fire kept up for some time, with the Kure men firing in both directions, occasionally running into the cave for more ammunition. Someone in Dog Company conceived the brilliant idea of burning them out. They got hold of a 55-gallon drum of gasoline and managed to get it to the top of the hill, pouring it down on the Japanese below and setting it on fire. That obstacle was removed. At 0950 on the 8th of August, the first wave of the 2nd Marines, Combat Team C, reached the fringe of Gavutu and landed between the 2 cement piers. By 1,000, they were treading on death's doorstep. In the second wave, Company K found numerous dead paramarines in its path. Company M landed under sporadic fire, for the Japanese were still full of fight. Attached to the 2nd Marines in support of the assault on Gavutu was the 3rd Platoon, Company A, 2nd Pioneer Battalion, under 2nd Lieutenant Harold A. Hayes. Hayes's demolition experts, the go-to-hell men, were just what was needed to blast out the island's resolute defenders and seal the caves. They came ashore on Gavutu, right next to the landing craft of Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Hunt. Among Lieutenant Hayes's pioneers were Illinois-born Russell L. Jarrett, Henry Duke, a quiet Texan, and Barney Booz. Emery B. Ashurst, a demolition squad leader, recalled, "We took up our position at the intersection of the Causeway and Gavutu and manned a 13mm anti-aircraft machine gun. We proceeded to dispose of bomb duds and blow caves after the Japanese refused to come out. At one cave, as I was placing a charge, a shot went off, and I wasn't sure if someone was shooting at me or killing himself. It turned out an officer had shot himself with a rifle, using his toe to pull the trigger." The 2nd Platoon, 2nd Pioneers, under 2nd Lieutenant Arthur K. Simonson, with Sergeant George Gable, Corpsman Harold B. Rice and Roy M. Ford, and machine gun specialist Michael A. Masters, were among the mere 30 men who made the Tulagi landing about noon on the 8th. They passed beat-up Chinatown and went ashore at the Sasapi Jetty, the former boat-building area of Tulagi. Meanwhile, 2nd Lieutenant John S. Skip Henderson Jr. and his 1st Platoon landed on Gavutu and shuttled men between there and Tanambogo. Only 98 pioneers were on the 3 islands. Elements of the 10th Marines were fed into the Tulagi-Gavutu-Tanambogo meat grinder at a later stage of the struggle. The cannon cockers of Company 1, 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, in company with elements of the 2nd Marines, landed at Lever's Dock on Gavutu, while Company H, 3/10ths, was shifted to Tulagi and landed at the Government Pier. Battery H moved inland between the Sasapi Jetty and Chinatown and faced Gavutu and Tanambogo. Warren Fitch of Company L, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines from the President Adams, recalled his company's arrival on Gavutu. The paratroops had met stiff resistance. At the end of the 7th, they called for help. Company L was alerted at 4 a.m. on the 8th to get ready to go ashore and to take what we needed for 72 hours. At daybreak, we loaded into landing boats. The 1st Platoon led the way. This was my platoon. I had the 2nd squad. When the boat hit the beach, I was first out. There were several Marines lying there, and I landed in the middle of them, thinking to get news from them as to what the situation was. I looked to the right, where there were 4 dead. I looked to the left, there were also 4 dead. Advancing about 25 feet, I was told to keep my squad down. There was a log and sandbagged bunker just ahead. They were having trouble getting the bunker cleared out. We had one more trick to try. About 5 sticks of dynamite were tied to the end of a 12-foot board. This was lit and shoved into the bunker. When it exploded, the whole top seemed to raise about 2 feet and then settle to ground level. The bunker was then quiet. Company L, having landed on the north end of Gavutu, then made a sweeping line toward the south. It eliminated a couple of machine gun nests along the way and then came upon a disabled Japanese plane half above water. When the Marine who waded out to check on it was fired on from the plane, Fitch's company shot back and killed whatever enemy was there. Fitch relates that Company L was motivated by the memory of the reported Japanese atrocities after the enemy had taken Wake Island on the 23rd of December 1941. Several times there on Gavutu, 2 or 3 Japanese tried to surrender, but we cut them down. We had a battle cry, "Remember Wake Island." As far as we knew, all Marines were killed on Wake, and we were not going to take any prisoners. If the Japanese had announced they had taken prisoners on Wake, it would have saved some of their men. As we advanced along the south shore of the south end of the island, we came to the ridge that ran its length. We encountered some caves on the rock edge of the shoreline. A couple of nude Japanese soldiers ran out onto the shallow coral reef, but with about 25 Marines firing at them, they didn't make it far. We then started receiving fire from the caves, some at ground level and some from a height of 15 feet. To return fire directly into the caves, we had to wade out onto the coral reefs in about 10 inches of water. To the Japanese soldiers, we must have looked like ducks in a shooting gallery. Our platoon Sergeant Hill took a bad groin hit, and a corpsman was killed while going to his aid. A Marine behind me told me to step to one side as I was in his line of fire. The split second I moved over, he was hit in the left shoulder. Since he was about 3 inches shorter than I was, it would have been a heart hit for me. Several more were wounded around me. When the firing from the caves let up, we retraced our route on the island. That evening, at sunset, taps was played. We had about an hour of rest before taking beach defences for the night. During this lull, the words "war is hell" kept going over and over in our minds. I had a pretty good idea of its meaning. While the Leathernecks were clearing out the stragglers as best they could, some enemy airmen were hiding in the nooks and crannies. P.O. Marakazu Yasuta from Osaka, Japan, found a spot near the Gavutu wharf to hide. It was a locale he knew well, as the flying boats were usually fueled there. The area was crawling with Marines, some within feet of his hiding place, but Yasuta managed to conceal himself. That night he emerged slowly, managed to get to the beach unseen, and swam to Florida Island. Yasuta's war was almost over. First Lieutenant Frederick W. Riggs, who landed on Gavutu with Company K, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, recalls, "It wasn't long after the 0200 alert on the 8th of August, on board our transport, President Adams, that the 2nd Platoon of K Company was in Higgins' boats and headed for Gavutu, presumably to relieve the paratroopers who had met considerable opposition there. On approaching the island, it was evident that the Marines from the previous landing group had not pushed up to shore, but we were still taking cover in the deep water surrounding the island's banks. Pushing ahead and climbing on shore, we were immediately subjected to intermittent fire from Tanambogo off our right flank. Sea Plipple Johnny Blackburn of Tyler, Texas, attempting to take cover under a fallen coconut palm, found the space already occupied by the enemy. Blackburn was able to shoot before the terrified Japanese could react. The platoon then moved up the steep slope of the dominating hill, and from that vantage point the surrounding islands, including Savo, were in clear view. We watched Tanambogo being attacked by our own SBDs, which flew from the south, dropped their bombs, and continued northwards towards Tulagi. Unfortunately, one of the pilots approaching Tanambogo spotted us on Gavutu, and, thinking we were Japanese, banked his plane to the west and dropped his bomb, with fatal results on Mike M Company's machine gun squad, which was temporarily attached to the 2nd Platoon. That afternoon and evening a heavy rain fell, soaking us, and we were near incapacitation from the cold. In the dark, we were able to locate and move into a large water-filled depression where we sat, somewhat warm and relaxed. We watched the fireworks and heard the gunfire of a tremendous naval battle off Savo and waited for the rain to stop. When dawn arrived, by the faint light, we discovered that we were sitting in a shell hole, warm and red with the blood and body parts of our comrades, the victims of the previous day's bombing. A temporary aid station was set up on Gavutu at the Lever's bullet-peppered store. It was manned by 3 Naval Reserve doctors, Lieutenant Gilbert C. Campbell, Lieutenant John N. Roberts, and Lieutenant Irwin T. McAmey, all assigned to the medical team of the 2nd Marines. Their skilled hands provided some relief for the Schutz's doctors, who were nearing exhaustion. The corpsmen all went into harm's way. 2 of these unarmed medics, though wearing the Red Cross red and white armbands, were killed while attempting to aid a wounded Marine. A 3rd attempted to rescue the downed Marine, but was also shot to death. Apparently, the Japanese did not respect the Geneva Convention guidelines regarding the safety of medical personnel. 1 corpsman, PHM-1C Eugene Edward Baxter of Company D, 2nd Medical Battalion, was recommended for the Navy Cross for this action. Richard N. Vorwaller of Company M, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, recounts his experience on Gavutu. In the early morning of August 8th, just after daylight, the 3rd Platoon, Company M, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, moved down the cargo nets of the President Adams into the waiting Higgins boats. Our heavy .30 caliber machine guns, along with spare parts and boxes of ammunition, were lowered into the waiting boats. Our packs held 3 days' sea rations, a poncho, an extra pair of socks, and a belt of machine gun ammunition. We also carried 100 rounds of .30 caliber ammo for our .30 .06 bolt-action Springfield rifles. We had 1 canteen of water, a bayonet, a fighting knife, and a gas mask. All boats formed up and started for the shore of Gavutu. Because none of us really knew what war was like, we were not afraid, just a little apprehensive maybe, but not really scared. It was very quiet going in, Then an older man in our platoon named Bill Wyndham opened the bolt in his rifle and fed a clip of shells into it. Private Ackerman asked, "Are you loading your rifle?" To which Wyndham replied, "Hell yes, man, this is war." At his reply, everyone in our boat loaded their weapons. Lieutenant Robert O'Brien, our platoon leader, said, "We have done everything according to rank, and we're going out of this boat according to rank." O'Brien was the first out. As we left the landing craft and headed up the beach, there was fire coming at us, but every man in the platoon made it ashore without being hit. We moved to the Lever Brothers store and up to the foot of the hill, where we set up our guns to cover the island of Tanambogo. From there we could see the end of Gavutu, the causeway between the two islands, and the whole side of Tanambogo that faced us. After our guns were set up, we began a barrage of fire over the whole island of Tanambogo, covering it from top to bottom. One incident I recall happened to me during this heavy firing as I was shooting from a natural depression about 1.5 feet deep. I saw a dual heavy machine gun firing from a position on top of the hill of Tanambogo back at us. They were using tracers, and everything seemed to be moving in very slow motion. It looked to me as if the tracers were just floating in the air, but they were coming directly at me. I rolled to my left as fast as I could, and the bullets impacted the ground right where I had been lying. Robert C. Libby, also of Company M, describes August 8th from landing to nightfall. For information on events, we were very much left in the dark. However, later in the day we were informed we would be put ashore the following morning. Saturday, August 8th, dawned bright and clear. Once in our landing craft, we pulled away from our ship and headed across open waters towards the island of Gavutu Tanambogo. The first Paramarines had landed there on D-Day. We were told that due to this outfit having been mauled somewhat by defending forces, we were being sent to relieve them. Drawing into the waterfront, we bailed out of our boats and moved along the pier towards the island itself. My team, equipped with 81mm mortars, had the job of hauling the shells. With each shell, in that heat, they got heavier and heavier, and I wished I had another assignment. Right after landing on that pint-sized island, with sporadic gunfire going on, I saw my first dead Japanese defender lying face down with a rather large hole in the back of his head. Naturally, momentarily stunned, I stared, and then moved on past an old corrugated iron building, which was used as a sick bay not too far from the dock. I was soon inland taking a survey of my surroundings. Directly before me rose a steep hill of some 100 feet or so, by my estimation, actually 148 feet. To my right and left was flat terrain, and facing the hillside and looking to my right, I could see the causeway linking Tanambogo. It appeared to have a flat area stretching away from a hill similar to that on Gavutu, but not as high. From the top of the hill rose a tall mast with the Japanese national flag fluttering in the breeze. We set up our 81mm mortar and prepared to fire on this outstanding target. Under the direction of a special non-com rangefinder, we attempted to topple the flag. A short spurt of firing failed, though I believe a supporting destroyer lying hove to the island successfully carried out the task. With no ground action taking place in our sector at the moment, we were ordered to dig our shelter. Information was given out stating we could expect the Imperial Navy to pay us a visit around midnight. As the afternoon wore on, plans were set in motion for the night's defence of our position ashore. Patrols were organised. The password was given as darkness settled over the place. We were told the Japanese were unable to say words containing double L, so the word yellow was the password for that night. Somewhere between 2200 and midnight, heavy rain set in. The night became even blacker until we were unable to see anything moving about. This, of course, brought a sense of panic among the troops. It got so that while on patrol, one had to incessantly repeat the password or else die right there. Having done my stint on one such patrol, I returned to my waterlogged shelter. Barely settled down in the water, I got a call from the shoreline that Japanese were swimming from close by Florida Island towards our island. All hell broke loose. Rifle fire screamed across the flat area before me in all directions. Sizing up the situation, I decided to remain where I was, even though an order had been passed for everyone to move to the beach. Obviously, more casualties ensued as a result of our own trigger-happy troops than were caused by enemy action. Lewis Carr of M Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, witnessed one of the most horrifying incidents of the day. Our first few hours of enemy contact on Gavutu seasoned us for what lay ahead, and we soon found out that this game was a deadly one. We were fighting a merciless, cruel foe. In just a few short hours, we built up such animosity and anger you would not believe. What really set us off was that our unarmed corpsmen were nothing but a target, despite the Red Cross band on their arm. I saw 2 corpsmen killed trying to care for one of our wounded. While we were halfway up the hill, one of our men was wounded. A corpsman, HA-1C Robert Wilson, came to his aid. They shot Wilson, pulled him inside a cave, and started cutting him up one piece at a time. First a hand, then an arm. We could hear him screaming above all the other noise of rifle, machine gun, and explosives. There was no other alternative but to blast the caves with TNT, killing all. Another Marine from Company 1, 3rd Battalion describes D+1. I-32 was in the reserve force, and because the landing on Guadalcanal went so well, we were not committed to any action on D-Day. The Marines not committed to the battle had no knowledge of just how it was progressing. Our sergeant had drilled into our minds over and over on the ship. When you hit the beach, stay low, don't make a target. Amazingly, he lit out on a streak and ran straight in and was killed immediately. After landing, I found myself next to a Navy corpsman who had a softball-sized hole in his shoulder. Under his direction, I packed his wound with sulphur and bandaged it. He said he was okay, so I started to crawl forward. About this time, my Lieutenant J. Wendell Crane motioned for me to join him. As I dropped next to him, my rifle accidentally went off, and the bullet went right past his head, almost blowing it off. He just looked at me, shrugged his shoulders, and pointed out our 2 tanks. They were in trouble. The Japanese were pouring out of caves and had surrounded them. They were beating on them with sticks, throwing rocks, and they set one on fire. We concentrated our fire on them, and afterwards counted over 40 bodies around the 2 tanks. But not in vain, as it was the turning point in controlling the battle. By that time it was getting late, so they positioned some of us along the top of the ridge for the night. Our orders were to control the ridge and not let anyone go through. Soon darkness came, and then heavy rain, and it poured all night. I remember sucking the water off my helmet chin strap. After a short time, we began to hear noises down below, and we began firing. I noticed a discharge flame from my rifle due to the dampness, and began to hear FFT in the mud around me. I suddenly realized they were firing at the flame my rifle produced, and I told the guys around me to hold their fire and why. The buddy on the right quit firing, but the one on the left kept on. In the morning, we found him dead. It was so cold lying there. My only relief was wetting my pants once in a while for a few seconds of warmth. Morning finally came. We were surprised to see how bad we all looked. The earth of Gavutu is red, and our dungarees had changed from green to red. We stayed that way for a few days until we could climb into the ocean and wash off. When Louis Carr of Company M, 3 halves, had reached the hilltop on Gavutu, he could see the adjoining island of Tanambogo. I saw a Japanese flag on top of the high ground, another area with natural caves and dug-in tunnels. You could see the Japanese running around from place to place. Company K set up machine guns, firing across the body of water between Gavutu and Tanambogo. Our 81mm and 60mm, also the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines pack howitzers, were shelling Tanambogo, knocking down the Japanese flag, but somehow they kept putting it back up. Meanwhile, the command structure called for aircraft and additional bombardment to soften up Tanambogo, our next attack. At about 1500 on D+1, Richard N. Vorwaller wrote, "The Navy destroyer Buchanan moved in on Tanambogo and began shelling the island at point-blank range. It was so close to the island that some of the shells did not have sufficient arch on them to hit so that they would explode. They would glance off the ground and back out to sea with the sound of a locomotive. After the destroyer pulled back, Company 1, led by Captain William G. Tinsley, landed on the right of the island. At the same time, a platoon led by Second Lieutenant John J. Donahue started across the causeway, and most of them made it. Our platoon was the machine gun support for Company 1, and we were attached to them in combat. For as long as it was possible, our guns kept up a steady fire, but finally had to halt for fear of hitting our own men. The reinforcements arriving at Tanambogo included Company 1 and sections of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. When Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Hunt, 3 Halves, was making plans for an attack on Tanambogo, Lewis Carr, M32, and Joseph A. Machuda of Company M found themselves volunteered to assist Company K with their Browning automatic rifles. Carr wrote, "We regrouped around Lever Brothers buildings where we could see the causeway. While we were regrouping, there was no let-up from our mortars, pack howitzers, planes, and naval gunfire. Machine guns, .30s and .50s, were getting in position to provide us fire support while going across the causeway. Finally, the shelling and bombing diminished. The moment had come. You got a deep, hollow, sunken feeling in your stomach as we proceeded down the causeway. A Japanese machine gun swung back and forth like a windshield wiper. First one man would fall, then another, but we kept right on going across. Finally, the machine gun was put out of commission by one of our mortars or machine guns from Gavutu. As we reached the end of the causeway, we were greeted by screaming Japanese sailors who came out of holes. Hand-to-hand fighting, man against man, Japanese with bayonets, knives, and pitchforks. I had a small bayonet on my bar. At times, one could not shoot because of the chance of hitting one of your fellow Marines. Along with Company 1 and sections of Company K were 2 tanks from the 3rd Platoon, Company C, 2nd Tank Battalion, led by 2nd Lieutenant Robert J. Sweeney. The Iron Monsters had as their principal weapon a 37mm turret gun. They embarked for Tanambogo in 2 LCMs called Mikes, and while the tanks were en route, the destroyer Buchanan poured fire from her 5-inch guns onto Hill 121 on Tanambogo. Then she moved near the very small Guyomi Island and commenced firing from another direction at the southeast side of Tanambogo. As the 2 tank lighters approached their starting point, they signalled the Buchanan to lift her barrage. At the same time, the 3rd Platoon, led by 2nd Lieutenant John J. Donahue, K32, started across the causeway, as Richard Vorwaller had described. Pishit James McCoy recalls, "We were brought off the hill on Gavutu and assembled on the small flat around the end of the causeway, where Lieutenant Donahue told us what was expected of us. We were to charge over the causeway and attack Tanambogo while I Company and 2 tanks were to hit the north. Donahue commanded, 'Fix bayonets,' and to follow him. He led us at a pretty good clip. After a brief period, I heard a steady crack of rounds going over our heads. I was burdened by my Browning, so I began to lag to the rear when Willie was hit, and that speeded up my pace. Why the Japanese fired so high, I don't know, but 3 feet lower they would have slaughtered us. I remember the charge over the causeway very clearly, because I was so damn convinced that I could not have survived. As I recall, among Platoon Sergeant Ferguson, PFC Cable, Corporals Miller and Trappier, Privates Curly Graham, Leonard E. Skinner, and Willie Smith, Willie was the only one to get hit. He got hit in the neck and went over backward. He was later evacuated." Puffed. Leonard E. Skinner remembered, "It did not take us long to cross the causeway, as it was a smooth surface, about 6 feet wide. We ran the entire way. We were probably exposed for only 3 or 4 minutes. During the crossing, the Marines were also subject to harassing fire from Guyomi. The crewmen on the LCMs, which had the tanks headed for Tanambogo on board, began firing their automatic weapons at shore positions on Gavutu, then added their 37mm punch in an attempt to blast open a stretch of the beach, their anticipated landing zone. At 1700, Lighter Hash 1 was to clear a path with its main weapon. On board were several leathernecks seeking protection behind the tank. The naval petty officer in charge of the lighter, BM2CGLD Sporhasi, had made a landing on Gavutu earlier, and had thoughtfully scrounged several sandbags for additional protection for the Marines. At this time, the Buchanan began pounding Tanambogo for several minutes. When the ceasefire order was given, the destroyer and lighter Hash one moved to the eastern shore of Tanambogo and prepared for a landing. On reaching the shore, the lighter lowered its ramp, and as the tank drove off, it and the Marines disembarking faced a hail of fire. One Marine was killed instantly. With its tank on shore, lighter Hash 1, which was having trouble raising its ramp, finally was able to pull away and go back to Gavutu to pick up additional troops. On its return to Tanambogo, the lighter again experienced problems with the retractable ramp, and the Marines had to climb over the gunwale. When the last man was off, the lighter pulled away. Lighter Hash 2, with its troops and Lieutenant Sweeney's tank on board, was less successful. It had hit Tanambogo's coral outcrops and remained stuck. The boatswain, BM2 CBW Henson, signalled the tank commander to ram through the ramp door, which Sweeney did. 14 Marines followed in fast pursuit. When Lieutenant Sweeney's tank reached the shore at 16:15, it took an aggressive lead, quickly outdistancing the Marines of Companies 1 and K, 3 halves, attempting to follow it. That was Sweeney's first mistake. His second was boldly sticking his head and shoulders out of the tank and firing haphazardly with his Tommy gun as the tank sped around. The sound of a single rifle bark was heard, and a bullet tore into his skull, killing him. Seeing that the tank was in difficulty, about 50 Japanese air crewmen scampered out of their caves and surrounded it. The frenzied horde dumped cans of gasoline on it and used handmade bombs as grenades. According to Louis Carr's published account, all the crew were killed except 2, who miraculously managed to escape. MCPO Masaichiro Miyagawa of the Yokohama Air Group wrote, "I recall seeing my officer, Lieutenant Sadada Saburo Katsuta, on top of the tank. Possibly he was the one who used the handmade killing tools to destroy the tank and its crew. This was the last time I saw him." Similarly, once ashore, companion tank Hash 14, commanded by Sea Type Leon Bud Richard, also outpaced its supporting Marines. The single objective in the driver's mind had been to reach a pest-hole pillbox that was causing casualties. Some leathernecks caught up and gathered behind Richard's tank for protection, but the vehicle got stuck between 2 palm trees. The Japanese airmen ran out from a cave by 2s and 3s and struck it with hand tools and bottles filled with gasoline, much as had been done to Lieutenant Sweeney's tank. Bud Richard was killed, and Danley, the driver, was shot and killed as he exited. The infantrymen fired at the attackers, but the damage was done. The Japanese airmen had ignited the gasoline-soaked tank, and Persit Eugene O'Moore, the radio operator, and PFC Ben Pugsley, the gunner, fled the smoke-filled vehicle, willing to take their chances outside. The credit for their survival goes to Persit Kenneth Kuhn, Y32. He was one of the infantrymen busy shooting at the Japanese to keep them away from Richard's tank. Kuhn is credited with killing 31 of the attackers. Meanwhile, Private Moore, outside the tank, was being beaten to a pulp by frenetic Japanese. There is no report on what happened to Pugsley after he exited. Private Kuhn recalled, "Well, the Japanese banged Moore something terrible. He was bleeding something terrible. He was bleeding, and I could not get a shot at them. Then they quit. They moved away. I guess they figured he was cooked. So did I. I never saw anyone lie there so dead. I decided it was time for Papa to get going too. That tank was out, and I was there alone. There was firing behind me now. The Japanese obliged by streaking for the pillbox cave. When they were inside, I decided to get going. So I crawled away easy-like, and there was no one in sight. I got up and made a break for it, heading for a Japanese bomb shelter. I hadn't gone 2 steps. When bang, I got hit, in the leg. Must have been a sniper. They were all over the place, raising holy hell. Funny they got me and the Japanese around the tank didn't. Finally, I made the bomb shelter. Nobody was in it. I lay there 6 hours until some Marine pals found me." The next thing Kuhn remembered was regaining consciousness with a corpsman bandaging him up and being on transport. Later, Kuhn and Moore were bed partners in a rear area hospital. By then, the pillbox was out of commission, but many Marines had fallen. Meanwhile, roughly half of Company 1 slowly crawled up the southern slope of Hill 121, while the remainder drove to the east and north slopes and covered the coastline. At the end of D+1, Lewis Carr and his companions spent a frightening night on Tanambogo. It wasn't too long before darkness had overtaken us and we dug in for the night. It was one of many sleepless nights, with miserable, hair-raising experiences. It started to rain, like pouring water out of a bucket. Your foxhole filled up, and to top things off, we learned the Japanese could pronounce-al, as well as we could. We learned this after 1 or 2 Marines had been bayoneted because of our password. We lay down in our foxholes face up with a poncho covering our weapons. One didn't dare sit up. The darned sand crabs were crawling all over you, sometimes pinching. There were hogs running around feasting on the dead and wounded. The Japanese soldiers tied buckets of junk around a couple of hogs and ran them through our lines. One didn't dare move or stand up, as you would either be shot by your own men or knifed or bayoneted by the Japanese. It was so dark you couldn't see your hand 3 inches from your nose. We were not only wet and miserable, we hadn't had anything to eat since 0630, when we had a simple Navy breakfast of baked beans, bread and black coffee so strong it would grow hair on a billiard ball. Company. I spent the next day rooting out the last of the Japanese. Most would not surrender, so their caves were blown up and the entrances sealed. The next night, the Marines were put on full alert and struggled to stay awake. The day after, the men sat down for their first food in 2 days, then immediately turned to bury the dead. Occasionally, in the days that followed, a Japanese was captured. One such prisoner, on Gavutu, was put to work digging a burial site, and obviously thought he was being made to dig his own grave. Having completed the task, he carefully laid away the shovel he had been using and turned his face to us, even as he stood in the hole he had dug. He was offered a cigarette, and with much bowing he gratefully accepted what he surely must have thought to be a kind gesture by the enemy, before dispatching him to the land of his ancestors. He sat on the edge of the hole and calmly smoked in silence. Once completed, he shredded the remains and stood up in the hole looking at us, undoubtedly expecting his execution. It was then pointed out to him the fact of a dead Japanese lying beneath a heap of rubbish. He was directed to bury the body in the hole he had dug. With a sudden smile crossing his face, he bent to with a will and soon had his chore completed. From that moment on, he conveyed to us a cheerful manner in carrying out his task. MCPO Masaichiro Miyagawa and a companion, S.A. Jinsaku Sakurai, spent 50 days hiding in one of Gavutu's caves. They periodically ventured out only at night to replenish their water. The shelters and caves had ample storage of food for air raids and kegs for water. When the Marines began to close the remaining caves with explosives, Miyagawa and Sakurai began scheming to escape to Florida. They stole out late one night to the coast and thought they might swim to the island, but because Sakurai could not swim, Miyagawa found a barrel lying on the beach area, and, using it as a float, Sakurai was able to paddle with some difficulty. The two lived on Florida for about a month, eating sweet potatoes and coconuts and living in abandoned native huts. They were caught by islanders in mid-October and turned over to the Marines on Tulagi. Sakurai later wrote that he believed Lieutenant Sadeda Takayuki Kurosaki and Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki had killed themselves or were sealed in Gavutu's caves. The taking of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo by the U.S. Marines ended a terrible cycle of death and destruction. Of the Yokohama Air Group flying boat unit on Tanambogo, only 4 survived. From the floatplane fighter unit, Hama Air Unit, at Halavo on Florida Island, only 2. From the Ida Butai, the 14th Construction Unit on Tulagi, and other construction elements, 16 are known to have survived. Of the Kure 3rd SNLF on Tulagi, 7 men were left alive: Esmi Kyoichi Takahashi, SM Masakane Iwata, Esmi Yoichi Hayami, PO-1C Shikia Yamamoto, SR Yuko Takamoto, SR Haruji Matsumoto, and Saburo Watanabe. The 10 officers did not survive. Of Lieutenant Mitsua's anti-aircraft unit on Gavutu, 4 gunners surrendered, 50 perished. Of the Hashimoto construction unit, also on Gavutu, almost all of the 132 were killed. Shinya Hashimoto and 1 other survived. The 8 radio operators from the 85th Communication Unit also lost their lives. As for the Paramarines, out of 361 men, they suffered 250 casualties, with 23 being consigned to the cemetery at White Beach on Gavutu. Plat Sergeant Ronald F. Kaczynski, Company A, 1st Parachute Battalion, buried in Plot 52, with the Pacific Ocean on his left, was one of them. In the Battle of Savo Island on the night of 8 to the 9th of August, 1 Australian cruiser and 3 American vessels, the Astoria, Quincy and Vincennes, went to their watery graves, taking with them 1,077 sailors and marines. Combined with the withdrawal of the carriers by Admiral Fletcher the previous day, this forced Admiral Turner to order the departure of the transports and cargo ships from the Guadalcanal waters, taking the supplies much needed by the Marines ashore. It took a few days for Leathernecks to get over the shock of the U.S. Navy's disappearance from the Solomon waters, yet they knew the war effort must continue on. The best of the Marines, the 2nd Regiment, made Tulagi their fort to hold. Mike Masters wrote, "The largest caliber weapons in the company, Company A, 1st Pioneer Battalion, or on the island, were our .30 caliber machine guns. They were of little value against the formations of Japanese bombers that came over Tulagi every day around noon, flying at about 5,000 to 6,000 feet, making their final turn, then heading for the airfield on the canal. It bugged me not to be able to take any action against the bombers or the snooper planes that buzzed us. I located a disabled landing craft, with an operable air-cooled 50 caliber machine gun, and set up a gun position on a hill overlooking the North Channel with a clear field for any enemy landings or planes. Having the only gun on the island firing at the Japanese stirred the Marines who were down on the beach. They cheered as if they were at a ball game. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion was to remain temporarily on Tulagi, and the much shot-up 1st Parachute Battalion was to shift there from Gavutu. On the 10th of August, the first of the chutes to arrive on Tulagi was Company A, assigned to defend the Sasapi area. Companies B and C followed. The next day, the chutes were ordered to move to the ridge in the vicinity of the J.B. Hicks House, where Assistant Division Commander, ADC, Brig General William H. Rupertus had set up his command post. On their arrival, the Paramarines were designated as Force Reserve. On D+2, the defence of Tulagi was divided into 3 major sections. Major Miller of the 1st Parachute Battalion, Combat Team A, took over the southwest sector, west of Line A and south of the ridge. Major Presley of Combat Team B took over the northwest sector, west of Line A and north of the ridge. The island sector of Gavutu, Tanambogo and Macambo was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Hill, Combat Team C. On the 10th of August, elements from Companies E, F and G of the 2nd Marines seized Mbangi and Kekumtanbu Islands without any opposition. The following day, the 3rd Marine Defence Battalion, MDB Detachment, which had landed on Tulagi at Sasapi on the 9th, took over as the defence unit for the Chinatown sector. The balance of the 1st Parachute Battalion arrived on Tulagi on the 11th. Temporary control of the Tulagi chutes was transferred to E Sector, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold E. Rosecrans, Colorado of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. The 1st Raiders were assigned as Force Reserve, with Colonel Edson given the additional duty as Assistant Chief of Staff and Assistant Division Commander. The plan included the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 2nd Marines occupying Tulagi. Companies K and M of the 3rd Battalion would remain on Gavutu. Company L, plus the 5th Platoon, Company M, with 223 men, and Battery 1, 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, were assigned to defend Macambo Island. Regarding the Macambo operation, C. Claude R. Blanchard, HQ 32, wrote, "After 36 hours of no sleep, I was told to go with Company L. I was the only wireman. I was to take 2 EE8 field telephones and a reel of telephone wire weighing about 80 pounds. Staff Sergeant John Revel assigned me to Company L under Lieutenant Michael Ryan. My very words were, "Why me?" The landing came off beautifully, and not a shot was fired. We lived on captured Japanese rice and green coconuts. We had little food, because the ships had left after the Japanese Navy hit the area. The only clothes we had were on our backs, and we landed with only our rifles, radio, and telephone equipment. Life on Macambo was great for a week or so. My only assignment, after laying the telephone line and hooking up 2 telephones, was to crank the generator mounted on a wooden stool for the radio operators to send coded messages at night. However, most of the time we were saddled with dead batteries. On Macambo, Blanchard found a pair of buildings belonging to a trading company, presumably Burns Philp. In the larger of the 2 was a walk-in steel safe with the door blown open. We selected the smaller one as our communications shack, the message center. Some Japanese warships took shots at us, intending to hit the message center building. They came close. After that, we moved our communications unit to one of Macambo's small hills, and would use the larger building with the walk-in safe in the event of an air raid, or in case the Japanese Navy improved their shooting. We lived in the open area with no shelter, only a poncho. It was good duty with no flies or the stink of dead bodies as encountered on Tulagi. Truly a beautiful island. Meanwhile, back on Tulagi, all was not quiet even after the island was declared secure. An occasional sniper would appear from nowhere and take pot shots at the Marines, while the noisy second pioneers were busy blasting caves with demolition satchels and stubby fuses attached to long poles. The demolitionists continued their handiwork off and on during the month. The Marines always expected that the Japanese would attempt to recapture Tulagi, but would first take control of Florida Island, then jump to Tulagi, and then move over to Guadalcanal. As a result, the command powers at Tulagi considered the island susceptible to attack at any time. S2C John M. Brolowski, USNR, was called on to help defend it during one of the condition Red Alert days. One Marine sergeant had our group of 11 sailors to assist in defending the island from Japanese invaders. He took us out to one of the beach areas and spread us out so many feet apart and gave us instructions on what to do if the Japanese tried to come ashore. We took our .30 caliber machine guns off our Higgins boats and secured them along the bank. He also gave us a handful of grenades and a quick explanation of how to use them. None of us had any grenade-throwing training, and I understand it's almost an art. He told us, "All you have to do is pull the pin, wait a few seconds." He never explained just how many seconds. Just a few seconds and get rid of the grenade. Talk about a fast course in grenade training. We got it. When morning came, we were secured from condition red, as it was now condition green, and we went back to our shacks. Coast Guardsman John P. Lanigan from the Haywood recalled, "In the days we manned the Higgins boats, and at night we were added to the forces that guarded Tulagi. We were assigned a machine gun position in the native cemetery, and our defence post was manned by myself and fellow seamen Ed Setterman and Harry Wild, and we had a Corporal Davis and CWO Dave Sauls, USMC. Right after the Savo battle, we had to go out and look for survivors." The Marines on Tulagi received a pleasant surprise package when 5 Amtraks, LVT, of 3rd Platoon, Company A, 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, delivered ammunition, food and water from the President Adams and evacuated wounded on the return run. The Tulagi Leathernecks were forever grateful. On the 8th of August, D+1 at Guadalcanal, the men of the 5th Marines uncovered the Japanese Communication Control Center, a radio transmitter station complete with antenna and electrical substation. Thinking the small green and red lights flashing inside the structure were the enemy, the young Marines sprayed the building with automatic fire, which caused some damage, but this was later repaired. The power substation was a special prize. It was just what the first signal company required. The radio station was in a prefabricated wood building containing 2 1,000-watt continuous wave (CW) radios, with its own power supply generated by a stationary diesel engine. From the station, a high-voltage cable was run underground to supply energy to the transmitter station and to the pagoda, a Korean-style building the Japanese had planned to be an officers' club. The one-story pagoda was now to become the nerve center for the Cactus Air Force, the aviation units of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps assigned to Guadalcanal Island, codenamed Cactus. Major Edward W. Snedeker, General Vandergrift's signal officer, put Second Lieutenant Sanford B. Sandy Hunt in charge of getting the radio operational. As a buck sergeant, Hunt had been responsible for the 1st Marine Division's cipher and code room when the division was headquartered in Wellington, New Zealand. Before the division sailed for Guadalcanal, he was commissioned and became the new communication officer. On Hunt's team was TSG Felix L. Ferranto, a crackerjack radio man, who repaired the captured equipment and made it usable. Ferranto, who had accompanied Admiral Byrd on one of his trips to Antarctica, deciphered the Japanese radio markings, and by the evening of D+2, the first signal company was able to transmit. Incoming messages via the fleet broadcast from Pearl Harbor presented no problem. Outgoing messages were the challenge. Tuning the receivers to where they thought the South Pacific Navy might be located, the men found a radio circuit and made a call to an unknown station. It turned out to be the U.S. naval station at Auckland, New Zealand. With that command's assistance, they managed to contact SyncPac at Pearl Harbor, which cleared the circuit and set up a permanent, round-the-clock operator network for Cactus traffic, with the call sign NGK. With Radio Guadalcanal activated, the Marines no longer had to depend on vessels at anchor to clear their messages. Station NGK, using a hand-operated paper strip cipher system and key lists, took over the radio guard for all message traffic, and the division began copying all incoming traffic in cipher. NGK was used not only for official business, but also for sending the war correspondents' stories back to Noumea or Hawaii. General Vandergrift saw no harm in sending the correspondents' messages without encryption, but before Lieutenant Hunt could transmit them, they would have to be cleared through Second Lieutenant Herbert C. Merilat, the division historical officer and correspondent liaison. Part of Merilat's job was to approve the press releases and get the permission to transmit from Colonel W. Capers James, the division chief of staff. James disliked reviewing the reporter's work, which he considered a lot of crap, but by late September he had been replaced by the more amiable Lieutenant Colonel Gerald C. Jerry Thomas, who had received a spot promotion to colonel. Sandy Hunt, then under Thomas's wing, received the title of signal assistant to the chief of staff. His job entailed handling routine encoded messages for General Vandergrift and Colonel Thomas, as well as what Hunt called paraphrased ultra-information, high-level coded messages already deciphered and re-encrypted, to be directed only to those who needed to know, which meant General Vandergrift and Colonel Thomas. Long after the war, Colonel Hunt wrote, "After the Navy took over naval communications from me, ultra-information was transmitted to their station in paraphrased form, and I delivered it to Colonel Thomas, no one else. So far as I know, no one ever saw an ultra message on the island except General Vandergrift and Jerry Thomas. There was no ultra operation on the island. We were just recipients of the information resulting from the Navy's deciphering operations in Pearl Harbor and Washington. The only history of naval communications ciphering and deciphering operations is that of my naval radio station NGK. All the traffic we handled was normal everyday variety, which included some paraphrased ultra information. The source of this information was never stated. Most of it turned out to be quite solid because it was from deciphered Japanese messages. The major reason we received by radio and messenger ultra information rather than ultra messages was because for security reasons we did not have high-class cryptographic aids, materials. Ultra messages were enciphered on electrically operated machines using very minimum distributed key lists held only by higher commands in secure areas. Once read, that material was returned to Lieutenant Hunt and burned. In the meantime, while the cipher system was being organized, the division radio men took over the former Japanese Kukum telephone exchange, and the photographic reproduction unit that had been aboard the transport Hunter Liggett, AP-27, was moved to that building's adjoining darkroom. At 11:59 on the 8th of August, the transport George F. Elliot again became a prime target, as it had on the 7th. 40 Bettys attacked, flying low over Florida Island to avoid detection. One flaming enemy aircraft, in a death lunge, suddenly swerved and crashed into the Elliot amidships. Burning debris was flung about the hold, spreading flames and rupturing the water mains. Flames gutted the ship, and thus the destroyer hull was compelled to sink her with 4 torpedoes. However, with the Elliot went most of the supplies. The men of the 1st Pioneer Battalion also were a target. On the evening of D+1, 2 members of the Pioneers, Privates Benson and Peterson, had volunteered to be part of an LCP crew, equipped with a TBX radio, that was to patrol the sea off Lunga Point, Guadalcanal, on the alert for any enemy activity. They never made a report and never returned. On the same day, August 8th, the Japanese 11th and 13th construction units had moved to the west bank of the Lunga River. They faced 2 major problems: food and radio communication. Captain Kane Monzen, the commanding officer of the 11th construction unit, took charge, with Lieutenant Commander Tokunaga Okamura as his deputy. Captain Monzen apparently had a shortwave radio and was able to contact the submarine I-121 offshore. In turn, the submarine forwarded his reports to the Japanese 8th Fleet and received messages for him in a similar manner. Monzen had planned a kamikaze attack, but abandoned the idea due to the small size of his force. The next day, August 9th, the 11th Construction Unit moved a short distance west to the Point Cruz area and established a defense line with about 200 combatants from the security force under Lieutenant J.G. Soichi Shindo. Additionally, the 11th established a second camp at the mouth of the Matanikau River, some 2.5 miles west of Lunga. The river formed a natural barrier, and the Japanese took advantage of its strategic value. The main body of the 11th Construction Unit now numbered a few hundred, including officers. Most of the labourers had scattered, but they did not take much food with them when they fled their camp, and what little they carried was gone by the 3rd day. The construction unit, also out of food supplies, was divided into 3 groups to check out native gardens. Petty Officer 2nd Class Sankichi Kaneda recalled, "The Kure 3rd, 84th Guard Unit, and the 81st Guard Unit, Nakamura Platoon, 2nd Howitzer Battery set up a line of resistance, digging foxholes at strategic locations under the command of Warrant Officer Tetsuzo Nakamura. The 2nd Battery Squads of Petty Officer 3rd Class, Isamu Matsuda, and Petty Officer 3rd Class Tan were positioned in the crossing area north of the river. On August 10th, Petty Officer Matsuda led a recon party to assess the enemy situation on the opposite bank. They encountered what were perhaps enemy scouts, and a skirmish followed. They ran into a patrol from the 5th Marines, and Seaman 2nd Class Nagayoshi Takayanagi was wounded. On August 11th, they encountered about 30 infantrymen, then crossed the river and reported, "Enemy attack, and there is a tank," but the enemy remained on their own side of the river. On August 13th, we were a howitzer battery without howitzers. We were armed only with handguns and found it hard to muster up a fighting spirit. We had a shortwave radio captured from the enemy on Wake Island, which allowed us to tune in to broadcasts from Sydney and keep informed on the general war situation. Food was also a severe problem for the Americans. Of the 60-day supply and 10 units of ammunition loaded by the 1st Marine Division at Wellington, only a few days' worth had been unloaded. About 4 units of fire, the number of rounds expected to be fired on a given day, were available on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Guadalcanal had 6 million rounds of .30 caliber ammunition and 890 mm shells. By August 15th, it was found that the troops had sufficient food for only 30 days, adequate B rations for 17 days, C rations for 3 days, and captured Japanese rations for 10 days. Marines were reduced to 2 skimpy meals daily, if they were lucky. Private Gaetano Kerace of Company C, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, recalled finding Japanese food. On the second day, we crossed the river and found the Japanese camp abandoned. I don't recall how many tents there were. All I remember is that the camp looked like it was ready for breakfast. One large tent had a safe with an abundance of Japanese funds, occupation money, and stationery. There were 2 warehouses stacked with food, rice, dried fish, canned grasshoppers, whatever you name it, it was there. The other warehouse was loaded with Japanese beer and sake. This food became very important to our survival on Guadalcanal, yet we did not realize it at the time. Somehow the beer and sake disappeared. A few Marines were seen wobbling around after sampling the Japanese beverages, but in the island's sweltering heat and with empty bellies, many became unwell and ended up on sick call. One interesting detail: the engineers made the Japanese power plant operational, which provided ice and made life a bit easier. By Sunday, August 9th, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, had established a beach defence from the east branch of the Lunga River to about 1,000 yards west of Kukum Creek. The Japanese had indeed deserted the area, as Private Geras had noted. The Marines found a 3-inch naval AA gun, a 25mm and a 13mm machine gun, and a Type 41 6-Salami howitzer. However, at 10 o'clock, another forward patrol from Company A, 5th Marines, operating behind enemy lines in the Matanikau sector, was surprised and driven off by a Japanese force under Petty Officer 1st Class Goro Sakurai of the Guadalcanal RXI Security Force. Both sides suffered casualties. The Marines backed off temporarily, assured that they would meet the enemy again. The next day, August 10th, 20 Bettys and 14 Zeros flew from west to east, but no bombs were dropped. 4 fighters made a low sweep along the beach line, dropping 2 parachutes in the area of the Japanese Navy forces west of Lunga Plains. They were apparently looking for Admiral Turner's transports, which by this time were halfway between Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo. The aircraft dropped their bombs and returned to their base. The Japanese 5th Air Attack Force reported, "Observed along the coast about 50 enemy-type small landing craft. Received intense machine gun fire while in the air above the mouth of the Lunga River. There is a pile of crates beside the Lunga River." On August 11th, 6 Bettys flew from east to west. They dropped no bombs, but apparently took photographs. The next day, Lieutenant Commander Keisuke Matsue, senior staff officer at the headquarters 8th Base Force, reported on reconnaissance by Japanese land-based attack planes. Some enemy troops were observed near the Guadalcanal airfield, but their movements appear unhealthy. Also, abandoned boats were observed along the coast. It is now possible to believe recapture will be easy. Following the shock from the sea battle on the 8th at Savo Island, where the Imperial Navy sank 4 Allied cruisers, enemy units are in confusion and anxiously trying to withdraw. We should be able to mop up the remnants quickly. With the U.S. 1st Marine Division were 7 men from the Samoa-based 8th Marines, part of the other breed, the 2nd Marine Division, which had been temporarily detached and ordered to join the 1st Division in the Coro Islands for the trip to Guadalcanal. Sergeant Elmer R. Widman of Company L, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, and the 6 others in his party were cartographic specialists. They were ordered to report to headquarters, 1st Marine Division, where they were directed to measure and study the characteristics of Guadalcanal's rivers and report their findings. Widman and his companions were essentially on their own and had to seek food from various outfits since they belonged to no particular organization. Ray Whitaker from the Barnett recalled, "After the boat crews discharged the Marines, they returned to take off supplies and ammo. Things got bogged down on the beach. Lieutenant Eubanks, who was in charge of the Barnett's landing craft and the boat crews, reported that supplies were piling up and the Marines were doing little, if anything, about moving them. Some supplies were lost in the ocean when the tide came in." 2nd Lieutenant Carl Thayer Soule, D2, remembered, "Crates and boxes were piled high for almost a mile. Many, too near the water, were partially submerged at high tide. The mess was not cleaned up until D+10, when the 2nd Pioneers appeared." Lieutenant Harold A. Hayes commanded the 3rd Platoon, Company A, 2nd Pioneer Battalion, which was attached to the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, on board the Adams. During the morning of August 7th, a message was received aboard ship requesting that shore party personnel be sent to the beach from the 2nd Pioneers to man at least one unloading point. I took about half my platoon, and we landed sometime before noon on D-Day. I reported to Major Bob Ballance, 1st Pioneer Battalion, whom I knew, as instructed, and was informed to move down the beach and help move supplies off the beach and into the dumps. We landed without equipment other than ourselves, so the work effort was all manual. We did all sorts of things, helped direct traffic and move vehicles off the beach. This continued until late afternoon when we received a message from the CO of the 3rd Battalion to return to the Adams. As soon as possible, we were to move out in the evening for another destination. I reported to Major Ballance and found an LCP from the Adams, then embarked and returned to the ship, arriving about dusk. The staff officers who planned the watchtower operation were novices and pressed for time. No one had done a thorough analysis of Plan Q, the strategy for moving the supplies to shore and then inland. It had not been entirely worked out at staff meetings. Consequently, by D+2, the beach was piled high with an assortment of materiel. At one juncture, the beach held 100 lighters, and 50 Higgins boats were lying offshore. Had the Japanese struck the beach, it would have spelled doom for the expedition, but the Marines' luck held. A few combat troops were relieved from defence duty and ordered to move the cache inland. However, the ground pounders paid for the command negligence, as they had only a small number of trucks, most of which were broken-down Japanese vehicles. Some troops, instead of moving the supplies, simply walked away from the area. They felt they had come to fight, not to become stevedores. While the Marines were holding on to a small portion of Guadalcanal, the Southwest Pacific U.S. Army Headquarters issued a press release headlined, "The Army lands in the Solomon Islands spearheaded by the U.S. Marines." General MacArthur was claiming recognition for a minor role in what others had indeed spearheaded and accomplished. This attempt to seize the limelight vexed Admirals King and Nimitz and resulted in a flurry of messages between Hawaii and Washington. The U.S. Navy had to ignore the situation, much to its disgust. The U.S. Army Air Forces in Australia were to assist in the Watchtower operation by using the 5th Air Force to neutralize the Japanese airfields on Rabaul, tying down their aircraft so that they could not interfere with the island landings. Sergeant Edmund L. Trottier of the 93rd Bomb Squadron, 19th Bombardment Group, flew in B-17E, 412461, in the D-Day attack against Guadalcanal Airfield and Rabaul East. 13 B-17S took off at dawn on August 7th en route to the target, reaching the area at about 11:15. We spent 5 minutes bombing, only to be jumped by about 30 Zeros. In the fray, we lost one fortress commanded by Captain Harl Pease Jr., AAF, and his crew. At the time, the B-17S hit Guadalcanal. A squadron of North American B-25 Mitchell bombers also attacked the Japanese airstrip at Leh, but did negligible damage. Consequently, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force was able to send off 4 flights of bombers and accompanying Zeros to attack the Watchtower invasion fleet on D-Day. Capturing the Guadalcanal airfield was uppermost in General Vandergrift's mind. The objective was to seize the airstrip and use it against the enemy. By mid-morning on D+1, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and 1st Platoon of Company A, 1st Tank Battalion, crossed the ILU River and moved cautiously along the coast. The uneasy Marines returned imaginary gunfire. By nightfall, Colonel Leroy P. Hunt, commander of the 5th Marines, had his 1st Battalion in possession of the airfield, a property of great value as it made Guadalcanal a landlocked carrier. The only thing lacking was a complement of aircraft. Colonel George R. Rowan, commanding officer of the 1st Pioneer Battalion, directed his executive officer, Major Robert G., to assist the Marine engineers, the airstrip builders, in every way possible. The 490 men of the Pioneers had been parcelled out to various units, and they were fortunate to have landed one regimental supply, R4 bulldozer, which became the airfield's workhorse. The engineers and the men of the 1st Pioneer Battalion worked on the strip from morning until just before dark, and rebuilt it foot by foot. The Japanese had left 8 small but useful tandem rollers and several Kato tractors. They also had installed huge lights, most of which were high and untouched by the bombardment, but the Marines would not dare use them with the Imperial Navy controlling the sea and each night prowling for targets. The 1st Special Weapons Battalion did set up its weapons on D-Day: .50 caliber machine guns, 37mm anti-tank guns, and 20, 40, and 90mm anti-aircraft guns. These, plus the weapons of Major J.S. O'Halloran's 3rd Defence Battalion, helped keep the Japanese aircraft far above the airstrip, limiting their effectiveness. The goal was to complete the airstrip south of Lunga Point as soon as possible so that it could be used against the enemy. But the engineer in charge, Major James G. Fraser, commanding officer of the 1st Marine Engineer Battalion, had problems. The 11th and 13th CU had been working from opposite ends and were to meet in the middle. However, a hole existed in the airstrip, caused by a 500-pound bomb dropped by the 11th Bomb Group during the early August raids. The islanders from the Tasimboko and Matanikau clans that the Japanese had used as slave labour had carried reed baskets of crushed coral to the strip to fill the unfinished section. It was slow, back-breaking work, and when the American bombing started, the frightened islanders disappeared. Now, with the US Marines in command, Major Fraser's understrength battalion had to finish the task. The engineers had to use captured, worn-out tools, which no doubt already had suffered from tropical weathering. They had inherited a score of well-used shovels, some TNT, and 30 beat-up 3-ton stake body trucks, ex-Japanese, Model 1 1941 4X2 Toyota, as well as the 8 road rollers. 100 low-bed trucks had been in the Japanese truck pool, but most were not serviceable. It had been hoped that the Marine engineers could have the airfield operational by D+3, but this was no longer possible, for their essential equipment was still on board the transports Hunter Liggett and Macaulay, APA-4, and the attack cargo ship Libra, AKA-12, and some critical items were lost when the Elliott was sunk. Among the items needed were 2.5-ton trucks, which were not landed because the US Navy had decided they would not be necessary. On D+1, the engineers surveyed the airfield and determined that 2,600 feet of the runway, about 160 feet wide, was acceptable, but that the remaining large cavity needed to be filled and graded. Under exhausting conditions, the Marine engineers had moved thousands of cubic feet of crushed coral and had a crude strip completed by D+4. All that was then required was for their work to be tested. On the 12th of August, a PBY-5A from VP-24, flying from Ile Nou, New Caledonia, landed and bumped along on Guadalcanal's rudimentary airfield. The pilot was Lieutenant William S. Sampson, naval aide to Commercepac, rear ADM, John S. Stew McCain. Sampson was accompanied by Lieutenant C.W.K. Goodney, a member of McCain's staff. A small mishap occurred when the plane rolled into a bomb crater, and 20 Marines were needed to haul it out. Nevertheless, Lieutenant Sampson observed that if the potholes were fixed up, they certainly would have a landing field. The PBY was refueled from 5-gallon jerry cans, and Sampson returned to his base with 2 wounded Marines. The hard-working first engineers faced considerable problems with the airfield, as it had been laid out by the Japanese in a basin. Because of the constant rains, it often was like a river of mud, and thus a ditch had to be excavated to carry off the rainwater. Oil drums were substituted for drainage pipes, though later the engineers installed precast concrete ducts. The work started simultaneously with subgrading, using the captured Japanese equipment. The machinery was in poor shape for lack of proper maintenance, but it enabled the men to complete their tasks. While the land engineering work was proceeding, patrols from regimental headquarters and the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, moved along the beach south and southwest of Kukum. Combined patrols of regimental headquarters and Company A engaged an enemy party about 5 miles southwest of Kukum, killing 2 Japanese and wounding several. On the 11th of August, a patrol from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, moving west of the Lunga River, spotted 2 Japanese. One jumped into the river trying to escape and was shot. The other surrendered. The captive, W. Tsuneto Sakado, a Rikusentai, was taken to division headquarters, where Captain Sherwood F. Moran, the Japanese language officer, questioned him. The man looked tattered and hungry, and he indicated there were others who also were sorely in need of food and might wish to surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Frank B. Goertger, head of the 1st Marine Division's intelligence section, had limited information on the Japanese, and this seemed an ideal opportunity to expand on it. He approached Lieutenant Colonel Thomas, the operations officer, with a plan to seek out the enemy, hopefully locating some of those willing to come forward. Thomas did not wish to expand offensive operations at that time, but Colonel Goertger was adamant. His job was intelligence, and he had inadequate information. There was little that Thomas could do other than suggest, as Goertger outranked him. And although General Vandergrift heard about the proposed mission, he offered only tepid encouragement. Because the division was not interested in his initiative, Colonel Goertger decided to carry it out on his own. He planned to land his men near Point Cruz, investigate, and then hike back. On the 12th of August, Colonel Goertger formed a patrol to search out enemy positions where captured Rikusentai Sakado had indicated some of his compatriots might be found. However, the executive officer of the 5th Marines, Colonel William J. Whaling, who had led previous patrols to the area, warned Goertger to avoid the Matanikau Basin and the land west of Point Cruz, as he suspected a heavy concentration of Japanese in that sector. Whaling was right. The sea infantrymen of the 1st Company, 84th Guard Unit under Lieutenant Akira Tanabe, had joined the Matanikau defense line that morning. Worse, Lieutenant J.G. Soichi Shindo's 11th CU Security Force, 222 strong, also had moved into the basin, and the 119-man 13th CU Security Force under SPI Lieutenant J.G. Inado Yasuda was in the district. A deadly hornet's nest of enemy combatants had massed just where Colonel Goertger intended to land. Captain Wilfred H. Ringer, Jr., the intelligence officer, R2, of the 5th Marines, had been in favour of moving at an earlier hour. As it was getting late, he was growing more hesitant. Ringer had asked Captain Lyman D. Spurlock, the CO of Company L, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, if his men could come to the aid of Goertger's group if they got in trouble. Spurlock's reply was not encouraging. It would be difficult at night. 39-year-old 1st Sergeant Stephen Armstrong Custer, a former World War I soldier and distant relative to General George Armstrong Custer of Civil War and Little Bighorn renown, wanted a large, heavily armed patrol to investigate the area. Colonel Goertger, however, wanted to travel light, and despite the wishes of the others, he opted for a small party. The patrol comprised 25 men, the majority from the 5th Marines, R2 Section, Intelligence, under Captain Ringer, and the rest from the Division Intelligence, D2. The party included 43-year-old 1st Lieutenant Ralph Corey, the Japanese language officer of the 5th Marines, and an expert cryptanalyst, and 52-year-old Lieutenant Cedar Malcolm L. Pratt, the 5th Marine surgeon. The enlisted ranks included 1st Sergeant Stephen A. Custer, Plat Sergeants Denzel Caltrider and Frank L. Few, Sergeants Charles C. Arndt, Robert Stanfill and David Stanfer, CPLs, William Bainbridge, Ralph V. Benson, Aaron Gelzer, Joseph F. Kashuba, Henry L. Cowell, Robert R. Lyons, Theodore E. Ratt Jr., Stephen Serdula and Joseph A. Spaulding, and PFCs John L. Delano, Blaine G. Walter, Daniel L. Gaunt, Jack B. Kelly, and Robert W. Lovelace. Lieutenant Soule, the division photographer, was to go with the patrol, but at the last minute it was decided that taking photographs at night would not be practical. 21-year-old CPL Vernon C. Stimple, also from D2, asked to go along but was advised by Colonel Goertger to remain with the others and keep an eye on things. He assured Stimple that they would be back shortly. The patrol then left the Kukum docks by LCP at 1800 on the 12th of August. As Goertger pointed out the landing site, POW Sakado pleaded, Aye, aye. No, no, the colonel insisted. The conversation was loud enough to be heard over quite a distance, but the Coast Guard coxswain had difficulty taking them in to land, as the Higgins boat had run aground. They finally went ashore at 20:30 on the left bank of the Guadalcanal River, directly in the midst of the Japanese. The Marines went over the side and rocked the Higgins boat free. It then returned to its base. From that moment, Colonel Goetge's party was on its own. His plan indeed proved to be quite ill-conceived. He had taken no radio, the men had no automatic weapons, they had departed late in the day, and they had sailed into an enemy-dominated area. The Japanese had been watching the craft, and when the men went ashore just west of the river, the 2nd Platoon, 11th CU Security Force, led by Lieutenant Joji Soichi Shindo, was waiting for them. 2 shots rang out, and Custer and Goetge went down. The colonel was dead, the sergeant wounded. Lieutenant Corey was hit in the abdomen. Each time he cried out in pain, shots would be fired in his direction. The night was pitch black until enemy flares illuminated the Americans' position. Then machine guns began barking. Captain Ringer helped move Custer to the beach before the group ran for cover and fought, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Back at Lunga, members of the 5th Marines heard the distant muffled shots. Captain Spurlock, knowing of Ringer's concern about the mission, had phoned headquarters with his information. He was told to monitor the situation. Nothing was done to assist Goetge's patrol until the next day, when a reinforced patrol was assembled. The colonel's poorly thought-out operation had cost the lives of 21 Marines and a U.S. Navy doctor. Somehow 3 of Goetge's men managed to escape when they moved out under orders to seek help. Sergeant Charles C. Monk Arndt arrived back at 0530 on the 13th by swimming along the beach. Platt. Sergeant Frank L. Few arrived back at 0800. He had suffered a chest bayonet wound in the struggle. CPL Joseph A. Spaulding also returned by walking through enemy lines. The Japanese reported 7 men lost, including the platoon leader PO-1C Goro Sakurai. After a brief interview with Sergeant Arndt, a rescue party from the 5th Marines was put together at 0615. However, Arndt could not pinpoint the landing zone. Company A, 5th Marines, led by Captain William B. Kempfer, boarded Higgins boats at 0650 and headed for the Point Cruz area. At 10:10, Kempfer radioed that his company had landed about 10 miles from the base and had sighted an enemy unit. A support force headed by Colonel William J. Whaling, who organized 2 platoons from Company L plus a machine gun section, set out to join Company A. Both detachments were in radio contact. At 16:45, Whaling radioed the regimental command post that he was unable to find where the patrol had met its fate, and that he was moving to the mouth of the Guadalcanal River to work his way back. Late that afternoon, both units returned to the dock at Kukum. When word of the disaster reached the perimeter, the Marines were predictably angered. The incident would set the stage for a take-no-prisoners response. To add to the uneasiness, a small earthquake woke up the camp at 0235 on the 14th. The next day, the 15th, Pursuit William J. Carroll of Company C, 1st Pioneer Battalion, was on guard duty with an 11-man squad on the outer flanks of the ILU River near the deserted village of Volonavua. Suddenly, a single file of native constables appeared, their rifles properly shouldered. In the middle of this strange entourage was a tall, bearded white man. Puzzled by the stranger's rough appearance, Private Carroll and his mates held their weapons ready. In a crisp British accent, the man introduced himself as Captain Clemens of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defence Force and asked to be taken to the Marines' headquarters. Bill Carroll turned to his companions in amazement. "Now I have seen everything." With the landing of the Americans, Martin Clemens had decided to come in from his coast-watching post deep in the Guadalcanal Mountains with his 60 native scouts to join the liberators. Private Carroll brought the party into the Marines' lines, and a jeep soon appeared with Captain Halstead Ellison, commanding officer of Company C, 1st Pioneer Battalion. Clemens was whisked off to Colonel Clifton B. Cates's 1st Marine Regiment headquarters, but before he left, Clemens asked Carroll to take his scouts forward, and the private obliged. The odd procession received curious glances from the Marines on the sidelines. On the 16th of August, the first Japanese reinforcements arrived on Guadalcanal when a 197-man detachment landed, the remnants of the Sasebo 200 Hells Islands 5th SNLF. The main body of the unit had been lost on the 8th of August while headed for the island, when the Mayo Maru, the ship transporting the troops, was sunk by U.S. submarine S-38 with a lucky shot from one of her usually unreliable Mark XIV torpedoes. The 17th became a significant day when the Americans renamed Guadalcanal's orange airstrip Henderson Field, after Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine dive-bombing squadron commander who was lost in the victorious Four, the 7th of June Battle of Midway. It was a fitting memorial for a gallant airman. General Vandergrift's prize was now ready to receive support aircraft. The mile-and-a-half area surrounding the airstrip immediately became some of the most valuable property in the world, for Henderson Field was the key to the Allies' ability to defend Guadalcanal and turn the tables on the enemy. Unfortunately, when the cow pasture strip was almost ready for aircraft, the Japanese staged a bombing raid that left 17 new holes in the runway, and the weary engineers worked 2 days to repair the damage. With Henderson Field now operational, albeit barely, avgas and specialized personnel to service and arm the aircraft were urgently needed. Fortunately, the U.S. Navy had 939 trained men from CUB-1, the airfield operating unit that had arrived the 11th of August at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, along with the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees, aboard the transports President Polk, AP-103, and Wharton, AP-7. The Cubs had originally been assigned to Auckland, New Zealand, which would have been heaven compared to Espiritu Santo, but even Santo was heaven compared to Guadalcanal. En route to Espiritu Santo, the Polk and the Wharton had stopped for 24 hours at Samoa and boarded 858 members of the 7th Naval Construction Battalion. The Seabees could do more to advance the war effort on Santo than at Pago Pago, Samoa. Meanwhile, while still at sea, the 6th NCB was assigned to the Watchtower operation, but no one on board was aware of the assignment or what the future would hold. The Bees learned of the marine landing in the Solomons on the day they reached the New Hebrides. The fighting builders of the 6th knew something was in the winds when they were confined to their transports, while their comrades in the 7th were immediately transferred to shore. The 7th NCB subsequently became the backbone of the construction force on primitive Espiritu Santo Island. Pending the stabilization of the Guadalcanal beachhead, it was decided that the 6th NCB would be the initial construction unit to move there. The bulk of CUB-1 would become the aviation component for Espiritu Santo Island, with sections transferred to Guadalcanal in increments as required. During the second week of August, Colonel Akinosuke Oka's 124th Infantry Regiment had received orders to move from Palau to Guadalcanal. On the 17th, at Tassafaronga, Guadalcanal, the destroyer Oikaze landed 113 men of the 2nd Naval Force from the Yokosuka 5th SNLF. The group was designated as the 1st Camp Relief Unit, under Lieutenant Tatsunosuke Takahashi, IJN. The unit's primary task was to transport vital radio transmitting equipment to the 11th CU, Japanese Navy headquarters, near the Oki River, Okigawa Rove Creek, not far from Point Cruz. The 11th CU had left its heavy communications gear at Kukum when it evacuated that area. The 1st Camp Relief Unit, which had started out from Truk with 1,069 men in a convoy of 8 warships, had encountered numerous problems. The principal vessel in the convoy, Kinryu Maru, was attacked by B-17S and eventually sunk. The destroyer Mutsuki had picked up the water-weary survivors. However, she too came under attack and was sunk. 2 patrol boats plucked from the water the remaining survivors that could be rescued and ferried them to Faisi in the Shortland Islands. At the Faisi base, the men received orders to deliver the much-needed radio equipment to Guadalcanal. Until then, radio communication with other units had been by runner, and communication with Rabaul had been via submarine, the boats acting as forwarding agents. As all these events were transpiring, however, Colonel Goetke and his men were not forgotten. On the 17th of August, companies the 1st and L of the 5th Marines, in 9 Higgins boats, made a landing at Kokumbona to the west of Point Cruz, seeking information on the Goetke patrol. A passing Japanese destroyer spotted the landing party and fired a few shots, but caused no casualties. Captain William Hawkins's Company B, 5th Marines, was to advance overland and join the others on his side of the Matanikau River. Company L, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, led by its executive officer, Lieutenant George Meade, Jr., was assigned the task of crossing the river upstream and attacking the enemy at the river's mouth. During the afternoon of the 18th, they had reached the crossing point, which was adjacent to a small stream running into the Matanikau. The following morning, the 19th, Company L engaged the Japanese while intercepting them trying to outflank the Marines. Lieutenant Meade and his platoon commander, Plat Sergeant John Brannick, were killed. Brannick was buried where he fell. Some 49 years later, a body was found while excavating for the U.S. Guadalcanal War Memorial. It was not identified at the time, and the spot was marked Unknown Soldier, but later DNA testing identified the remains as that of Sergeant Brannick. The Marines continued searching out the enemy by checking the villages of Matanikau and Kokumbona. In what became known as the First Battle of the Matanikau, 17th to 20th of August, the Leathernecks met stiff resistance when they confronted a mixed structure of naval units under Japanese Captain Kanae Monzen. The force consisted of about 140 men, including 7 officers, from the 84th Guard Unit under Lieutenant Akira Tanabe, 328 men from the 11th CU and 13th CU security units under PO 1C Morikyo Sashota, and the recently arrived 1st Camp Relief Unit, which was bivouacked nearby. W.O. Tetuso Nakamura of the 81st Guard Unit had 20 sailors from his howitzer platoon. Almost immediately, Captain Bert Hardy Jr. and Company Wurst ran into a fusillade of gunfire from the brush. Meanwhile, Captain Lyman Spurlock and Company L, with Colonel Whaling leading, were engaged in fierce fighting around Hill 73, including hand-to-hand combat. The Japanese launched 3 separate assaults. At first, the Marines buckled under the attack and took cover. Then they counterattacked and regained the lost ground. On the 18th, the 2 villages were pounded by the 11th Marines. PO2C Kaneda records. The enemy installed what we took to be field artillery on the high ground on the opposite bank, and at a regular time twice a day we would receive shell fire. It caused almost no damage, but the shells hit terrifyingly close.